afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Atlantic Council's Agent Orange Latin America Center. Thank you very much for joining us today for this incredibly timely conversation on Venezuela's regional elections, its potential effects on the political negotiations with Maduro, and the role of the international community. I'm going to welcome all the speakers in a moment, but first I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking Adrian Arst for joining us today. Of course, Adrian is the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and the founder of the Adrian Arst Latin America Center. Adrian, thanks for being here for this important conversation. While Venezuela prepares for another electoral and, frankly, negotiation crossroads, crime and insecurity are on the rise. Past week, Caracas has witnessed intense gun battles between organized crime groups and police as city gangs attempt to expand its territory beyond the barrios in which gangs are currently in. Crossfires have resulted in 26 deaths. And adding to the insecurity and the existing tensions in the country, just yesterday, we were all following very intensely as Venezuelan security forces threatened to arrest interim President Juan Guaido and did arbitrarily detain, while driving his car on the highway, opposition lawmaker and close Guaido ally, Freddy Guevara. We join the international community in the condemnation of these repressive actions by the Venezuelan regime and call for the release of all those detained for political reasons. As uncertainty increases and political persecution remains rampant, Venezuela is at this crossroad. In this context, political parties weigh their options. Yes, two opposition-aligned directors are now on Venezuela's national electoral body, the CNE, including Roberto Picon, who is joining today's conversation. But this is an electoral council that was installed by Maduro's illegitimate National Assembly. To assess the country's electoral situation, a European Union technical mission arrived in Venezuela last week to assess whether conditions exist to deploy an electoral observation for the upcoming elections. But the current electoral environment in Venezuela is anything but free or fair. And today's conversation is going to identify some of the measurable steps that the international community can take to continue promoting and enhancing democratic efforts in Venezuela. This discussion is also a result of the analysis and conversations with the Adrian Arst Latin America Center's Venezuela Working Group, which brings together Venezuelans and international practitioners to advance democratic stability by galvanizing support for actionable recommendations around the most pressing issues facing Venezuela today. This working group includes former government officials, heads of humanitarian organizations, oil industry practitioners, economists, civil society leaders, academics, a large swath of society, all in the hope of advancing a long-term vision and human-centered approach to Venezuela. So to dive into today's conversation, we are joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers. Kevin O'Reilly, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Sarah Cohn, Director General, South America and Inter-American Affairs at Global Affairs Canada. As I mentioned, Roberto Picon, a Director in the National Electoral Council in Venezuela. And we're also joined by two members of our Venezuela working group who are closely following the country's negotiation and electoral efforts. Colette Capriles, who is an associate professor and researcher in philosophy, politics, and social sciences at Simon Bolivar University, and David Smolansky, Secretary General Envoy for Venezuela Migration and Refugee Crisis at the Organization of American States. So to all of our speakers, Kevin, Sarah, Roberta, Colette, and David, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to begin the conversation with Das O'Reilly and Director General Cohn on the role of the international community in Venezuela's elections and negotiations, and then we'll have a second conversation on domestic perspectives. Please note that today's event is being simultaneously translated into both languages, and there's a translation interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Let me start off with you, Kevin, and ask the same question to you and as well to Sarah Cohn. First comment on what happened yesterday, the threats against Guaido, the fires that arrived at his house, the shots that were fired from guns at his house, the explosive at his house. They left, but then, as I mentioned, of course, Freddy was detained while driving on the highway. Please go ahead.
It's very simple. That kind of action against those political leaders is utterly unacceptable. Mr. Nicolas Maduro and his supporters are of the mind, or at least are saying publicly that they have an interest in holding elections, in working with the broad community of Venezuelans to do so successfully. And yet these sorts of outrages continue. It is simply not the way that it's simply contemptible, to be quite honest. And it has to end if the the folks around Mr. Maduro and Mr. Maduro expect to receive some sort of trust from the Venezuelan people in the manner in which they're going to conduct themselves.
Thank you. And Sarah, I'd love to give you the opportunity to comment from the Canadian perspective as well of the events of yesterday.
No, thanks very much, Jason. Look, I couldn't agree more with Kevin on this one. The arbitrary detention of Freddy Guevara is shocking, is unacceptable, is an assault on his fundamental democratic rights and those, frankly, of the entire Venezuelan population. Kevin mentioned trust. Negotiations succeed or fail based on trust and a commitment to negotiate in good faith. And so these actions raise some pretty serious questions. The release of political prisoners is a fundamental component of any kind of analysis of free and fair and credible elections on a go-forward basis. Canada, the US, and the EU have very recently, at very senior levels, reaffirmed our expectation that this take place in Venezuela. The events of yesterday call a lot of our assumptions about good faith into question. And the lack of information about Mr. Guevara's whereabouts, the attack on Mr. Guaido, all of this calls many things into question. We're watching it very closely and have a lot of concerns. History has shown us that there are reasons to be cautious. Yesterday reinforced that. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you so much. And as you say, this is coming just before negotiations are meant to kick off, and as Venezuela is also approaching elections next month. In fact, the representatives from the opposition and the Maduro administration are due to meet in Mexico to kick off Norway-mediated political and electoral negotiations. This 2 months later, we then have gubernatorial municipal elections with at least some opposition parties that may likely participate in those elections. And then, of course, the actions of yesterday and I think, frankly, the bad faith put by yesterday's actions. So I'd like to go back to you, Kevin, and ask you, how is the U.S. Lending support to the opposition or democratic forces in general for the upcoming negotiations?
Look, our position on this is fairly simple. 20 years ago this year, the United States, Canada, the hemisphere, including Venezuela, signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And the first article of that says that, the people of the Americas have the right to democracy. And their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. It's a pretty simple request. It's a pretty simple but profound standard. And that's what we hope for the Venezuelan people, and what what we are trying to help support: a peaceful, stable, and democratic Venezuela. So what do you need to get there? Well, you need credible, inclusive, transparent, local, parliamentary, and presidential elections that let Venezuelans choose their own course, whatever that course may be. And so we all need to see concrete progress in these fundamental areas. And so what we've been trying to do in the broad context of our policy is help create the circumstances internationally so that people within Venezuela and Venezuelans themselves can advance that goal. Now, Sarah's already touched on a number of these issues. Unconditional release of those who have been unjustly detained. Independent ability for people to organize their political parties and for those political parties to operate freely. We see recently the authorization for the regional elections for the MUD to operate in the regional elections. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not sufficient to meet that standard for the full autonomous organization of independent political parties. So there's still a lot of work to do. And so we continue with our active diplomacy internationally, and we continue with our focus on humanitarian objectives. You'll have seen yesterday, despite all the controversy, our Treasury Department has loosened certain restrictions on cooking gas because we see that it is fundamental to the well-being of Venezuelans in their day-to-day lives, so that they can then focus, we hope, on these broader, more enduring questions of political questions to help resolve their challenges. And we continue to look for ways to support international efforts so that vaccines to meet the challenge of this pandemic can enter into Venezuela. So we look at a pretty broad spectrum.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I want to go back and focus a little more on the election in a moment, but first back to you, Sarah, and ask you how Canada is supporting the upcoming negotiations, and also what you laid out, as Kevin mentioned as well, you laid out a few of the criteria earlier on what is critical for free and fair elections, but also how do you see Canada's unique role ahead of those regional elections, and especially in the role of Canada to promote the importance of internationally recognized electoral conditions?
Thanks very much, Jason. I'm going to flip that one, actually, because from where we sit, negotiations are what are needed at this juncture, leading to a political solution out of the crisis in Venezuela. Elections are an important part of that. Regional, legislative, also presidential. We can't lose sight of the full spectrum there, but they're not the only component. And a comprehensive agreement on a path to get there is the way out of this crisis, as I mentioned. That agreement obviously has to be driven by Venezuelans themselves. And really, it is our hope, and I'm sure Kevin shares this, that the conditions for free and fair elections will be met, which might allow us to recognize the results of what may happen, what may transpire in November 2021. We are watching very closely the technical mission that the EU has sent to Caracas, and which is there now. And we'll carefully assess their conclusions. We were optimistic that there had been some movement. Kevin mentioned the decision on the MUD. We're also looking at the the audits and the technical assessments that are currently underway. The decision to abolish protectorates. All of these were positive signs. But we have to go back to our conversation that opened this. The question of political prisoners is of huge concern to the international community. The role of an independent press, access to media, the ability for Venezuelans to exercise their democratic rights, all of this has to be safeguarded for these conditions to be met. To go back just very quickly to the broader negotiation space, there are also many things that we are looking for there. We've discussed amongst the three of us already the issue of good faith and bona fides from the regime, and some questions that have arisen in the last couple of days. We're also working very closely with the opposition to reinforce unity. We're working very closely amongst international partners, including the US and others, to reinforce unity in that space in order to support and ideally move the negotiation space into a new kind of dynamic, which we have not yet seen before. Jason, I think I'll leave it there and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Kevin, you spoke earlier about the negotiations. We didn't speak as much about the conditions around the elections. I'd like to ask you, especially, I think one of the things that's, especially the events of the last 24 hours, You're both recognizing some of the positive steps that have been taken recently with the mood and others, but it seems like we take one step forward and two steps back, especially with the events of yesterday. So, Kevin, how is the U.S., how are you weighing a very likely scenario? And of course, as Sarah said, hopefully these elections are free and they are fair and they meet internationally recognized conditions and people can participate and political prisoners are released. But how is the U.S. weighing a likely scenario where regional elections fail to meet internationally recognized electoral integrity standards?
Well, look, the fundamental thing is, and Sarah mentioned our friends from the European Union have sent a team to Venezuela right now. I haven't had a chance to consult with any of those folks. Yesterday's actions, yesterday's disruption of the political opposition to Mr. Maduro certainly makes it harder to demonstrate that that Maduro and his supporters are going to allow this to be a level playing field. The process from today through November and beyond will depend on how not only the electoral authorities operate and the decisions they make, but also how how they're allowed to take effect. And we don't dismiss the possibility that that they would be allowed to take effect, but this process has to meet internationally recognized standards. And if they meet internationally recognized standards, and that's not just, as we all know, that's just not the activities on the day with the ballot boxes deployed around Caracas and around the country. That's the whole process building to an election and the whole process of certifying and allowing people to act independently. If it meets those standards, and I'm certainly based on yesterday somewhat skeptical that there's goodwill to allow that to happen, but we will take an assessment of how it's actually implemented and how that process actually works. If it works in the best of ideal circumstances, it's it's an element of a broader panoply of things that have to happen in order to meet that Inter-American Charter standard, which I referred to earlier. It is not the thing in and of itself.
Important as we look at the elections, you're saying, Kevin, that frankly those conditions, those electoral conditions, frankly, are already beginning, and the actions of yesterday are part of creating or frankly not creating those conditions to allow for free and fair elections and for those in the opposition to feel like they can express their voice. They can question the government without fear of being released, being put into prison.
I'm a Cubs fan. Venezuelans play baseball too. It certainly felt like a brushback pitch to me.
Yeah. I'm a White Sox fan, but we'll talk about that later. Sarah, amid a new round of opposition Maduro negotiations in the upcoming elections, Venezuela, of course, continues to face a severe humanitarian emergency with regional reverberations. And of course, just this past month, Canada hosted the 2021 Conference in Solidarity with Venezuelan Refugees and Migrants that raised more than $1.5 billion, frankly, in grants and loans. So I'd like to ask you, how can Canada, in coordination with the broader international community, lead other similar initiatives and how to facilitate important comprehensive agreements to mitigate the humanitarian crisis? Because I think it's important that as we're having this conversation about elections and negotiations, that we continuously keep the humanitarian crisis front and center, because the efforts of the stifling of any type of of a political process, a democratic process by Maduro, has only helped to exacerbate this humanitarian crisis. So I'd like you to comment on efforts Canada can take and is taking to mitigate the humanitarian crisis.
Jason, thanks so much for this. And I'm glad you've taken us out of the baseball space, because I am a diehard Expos fan, and it's very difficult for me to contribute to this conversation. On the humanitarian space and on the donors conference, however, I am very happy to give you maybe just a couple quick updates, because once the final tally has emerged, we collected a total of 957 million in grants and 1.4 billion in loans as a result of the activities last month. So that brings us to a total of 2.35 billion US dollars in terms of money raised. And in terms of grants, which as we know is the part of particular interest to most recipient countries that are receiving Venezuelan refugees and migrants, we've seen a 45% increase from last year. 7 new donors have joined, and the private sector participated for the first time. I raise all of this because it demonstrates in a very difficult year, and in a year in which many countries, donors included, are grappling with the effects of COVID and grappling with the effects of a variety of decisions that are hard, that need to be made internally. The generosity and the recognition of the crisis, its unprecedented magnitude, its severe underfunding in the region, was demonstrated through a very clear sign of solidarity at the conference that we hosted last month. As you noted, this momentum needs to continue, and there's considerable interest amongst the various coordination mechanisms, including the Quito process, including the group of Friends of the Quito process, which represents the donors, the R4V interagency platform run by the UN, the LAC-RMD coalition of NGOs, to continue working together over the course of the next year to tighten up coordination, particularly in the donor space, in order to make things easier for the 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean who are hosting this unprecedented wave of migrants and refugees. Now, obviously, the focus of the conference was on the regional. Many of these pledges will also address the humanitarian crisis internal to Venezuela, which is, of course, the push factor, and is what is leading to this exodus of humanity and these terrible decisions that people are having to make to leave their homes and leave everything behind and take their families and travel in unimaginable distances. Internal to Venezuela, we're encouraged by the work of the Mesa Técnica between the interim government and the regime on vaccination. Kevin mentioned this earlier. It's such an important component of what needs to happen and needs to continue happening. It has, of course, had its ups and downs. The mechanism's important, but it's also important as a confidence building measure. And here again, I come back to my comments earlier about all of these are trust exercises where good faith is going to be measured and where the consequences of a demonstration of bad faith are going to be long-term and very difficult to walk back. The role of Venezuelan civil society cannot be underestimated or undersold in this space. And the international community can assist in a variety of ways. We've all been encouraged to see the access or the beginning of access for the World Food Program. And we're very happy to see that they've begun to deliver. We'll watch and make sure and watch very closely whether or not they're able to continue the access. Because fundamentally, and I'm going to track back to the negotiation space, which is a bit the meta framework under which all of these conversations, elections and humanitarian and everything else, also have to lodge. We have to preserve humanitarian principles, including neutrality, and not politicize that space. And that's also where the international community is going to come in very hard and very deliberately in order not to jeopardize the work of humanitarian actors, but also to ensure that the aid is actually going where it needs to go, which is to the Venezuelan people who are living something right now very difficult.
Very, very important point, Sarah. And I want to pick up one point you mentioned among the many excellent points is good faith, bad faith. And Kevin, that takes me to the recent US, EU, Canada joint statement around announced that the countries were willing to review sanctions policies based on meaningful progress in a comprehensive negotiation. You referenced sanctions earlier, but I'd like to ask you what types of agreements and guarantees from the Maduro regime in the negotiation talks could meet the level of meaningful progress for the three countries, and in particular for the United States, to begin to think about a rolling back of some of the sanctions?
Well, first, what Sarah was just referring to, we've always made it clear a couple of things, that there's a humanitarian priority here, and when we see circumstances develop, we will take measures such as those we took yesterday on cooking gas to make it, to relieve pressure on Venezuelan people. And on those sorts of issues, the health issues and others, we have created a regime to answer in the affirmative that good old-fashioned question as to whether we are, our brother's or sister's keeper, because the answer always is in the affirmative. And so we'll work on those standards. The rest of it, the fundamental principle of American sanctions programs is to incentivize action. It's not, they're not punitive fundamentally. They are to change behaviors. So we laid them out earlier today, first in the electoral context, and then in the broader principles regarding democratic systems. If we see sincere, comprehensive measures that will advance Venezuela towards stability and democracy and the rule of law, if we see rules that are set up for that process which are equitable, so that what's the old philosophical test that you design a system that is fair, that you're not necessarily sure what the outcome is going to be. You can't constantly play on a tilted table. Then when those kinds of opportunities are allowed for the Venezuelan people to freely express their will and to operate in a fair and equitable system, we will review and potentially amend and revise our sanctions regimes. That is a commitment of the United States government to this process.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I want to end with the last question with Sarah about an issue that I know is so important to Global Affairs Canada, which is advancing women's empowerment and political participation in Venezuela and across the region. Also delighted that here at the Agent Orange Latin America Center, we recently began a whole new effort with Global Affairs Canada support to advance women's political participation and training and capacity building of women leaders across Venezuela. So Sarah, last question for you is, how do you see the role of Venezuelan women leaders in the upcoming negotiation talks? And also, what are the long-lasting benefits of including the voices of Venezuelan women in these forums? I know we very much agree on this point and love to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Jason. And really, it's a pleasure to partner with the Atlantic Council on this particular initiative. This is fairly simple. Add women, change politics. We're delighted to see for the first time ever, women are being included in the Plataforma Unitaria's negotiating team. Frankly, it's about time. These are concepts, and I would just note that these are not Canadian concepts. The concept of the full and equal participation of women in politics and in all spheres of society is a central tenet of Canada's feminist foreign policy approach, and also of our feminist international assistance policy. We're joined by a variety of other partners in this space in Venezuela and around the world. I'm thinking in particular of Germany, in particular of Spain, but also others, working very closely with the US, the EU, and other partners in Venezuela on this one. Gender equality makes good sense and good policy. We know from experiences from around the world that when women are involved in mediation and negotiations to deal with conflict, that the chances of a lasting positive impact are greater. Women's participation in negotiations significantly raises the chances that the resulting agreement will last more than 15 years. A more inclusive approach means a more balanced agenda and a greater focus on longer-term impacts, benefits, and outcomes. And diverse negotiating teams help to keep biases in place. This is about diversity. This is about capturing a variety of views. Women are 50% of the population. But this also expands and includes a variety of other sectors of the population active in Venezuelan civil society and elsewhere. The trick here is not only inclusivity, but also incorporating those views. And so looking at whether or not views are sought, but then also integrated into the go forward strategy. It's important to also recognize that in what we're talking about here is the participation of women and why it's important. Women are affected disproportionately by conflict and experience it differently. Women are more likely to die from the indirect economic, health, human rights, and social effects of conflict. Domestic violence against women also increases in situations of conflict, sexual and gender-based violence as well. As a result, women's lived experience of security tend to incorporate multidimensional and forward-looking elements. And so we're thrilled to be working with the Atlantic Council to support these efforts. Jason, you mentioned our project, the one that we've recently just launched, which aims to increase women's participation and leadership in Venezuela's peace-building efforts. There is so much work to do in this space. And like I said before, it is one thing to solicit views, it's another to incorporate them. And that's really where the proof will be in terms of the success of the outcomes here. But I also go back to what I said before. This is the first time in the history of several attempts to negotiate in Venezuela that women have been fully integrated into the negotiating team. It's about time.
Yeah, I mean the timing is now, not only to get to the democratic outcomes all desired, but also to build, as you were mentioning, a sustainable democracy, which requires participation of women across Venezuela. And so thrilled to be partnering with Global Affairs Canada at this incredibly timely moment as we are entering into these negotiations with helping to support women's leadership across Venezuela. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. General Cohen, for your participation. Joining us today, Das O'Reilly. Always great to see you, and thank you so much for your participation. And to both of you, thank you for all the great work that both of your governments are doing on this important topic. I'll now turn it over to Diego Area, Associate Director and Venezuela Lead at the Agent Orange Latin America Center, for a conversation on domestic perspectives on Venezuela. Diego, over to you.
Gracias, Jason, y muchas gracias a quienes se nos unen el día de hoy. Esta parte de la conversación.
Thank you so much, Jason. This section is going to be in Spanish, and as Jason mentioned, we are going to have a conversation. From the domestic perspective, we have Roberto Picon, who is the current director of the CNE, and David Smolenska and Colette Capriles, who are members of the Venezuelan Working Group and old friends of the council. I would like to start, or rather we cannot start this conversation that we started first in English, now in Spanish, without talking about what happened yesterday with the imprisonment of Congressman Freddy Guevara and the persecution of Juan Guaido. I don't know if those who were watching this morning saw the videos from last night when they had long weapons drawn against Juan Guaido and his wife, but it's something that we do need to shine a light on. This is really just a bucket of cold water for Venezuelans. Really just a shocking reality of what is happening in the country and the citizens are facing to be able to exercise their political rights is starting in November and then in the future electoral elections in Venezuela. Today, based on all of this, there's a very significant debate within the ranks of the democratic alternative, as well as the international community, on what the strategy should be moving forward for these imminent regional elections in November, as well as the negotiation process that will potentially take place in Mexico, as well as the future in general for the democratic alternative. We at the Atlantic Council, through the Working Group for Venezuela, are promoting conversations to take this discussion out of the binary logic of whether to participate or not in the elections. Rather, we want to promote constructive discussion so that whatever the outcome of this fragile process might be, that civil society, political parties, and Venezuelan society, so that they don't continue to fragment even more, but they are able to take advantage of this situation to reunify, reposition themselves, and at the end of this chapter, through this play, that we will be able to be better positioned from where we began and with a greater capacity for internal pressure and better coordination. Our working group is a space where conversations are promoted among different actors with different perspectives, sometimes conflicting perspectives, but we all share our commitment to democracy and the future of Venezuela. These may sound they are working for free and democratic elections, but they have different visions on as to how to achieve it. I hope that you enjoy this conversation and that we will have a respectful discussion. Welcome to our participants who are with us today, and welcome to our audience. I ask the audience to send direct messages to the or to they can send conversation or questions to the chat or through Twitter and social media. I would like to begin with Rector Picon. Last night I read a publication of yours that you posted to Instagram about what happened yesterday. And it says, achieving electoral conditions conducive to participation is the responsibility of the CNE, political actors, and the Venezuelan state. We are obliged to contribute to make sure that the elections are credible and that they bring the citizens together. Only then will the result deserve national and international recognition. And so I want to ask Rector Picon, why should the international community now pay attention to these November elections? I would also like you to tell us a little bit about based on what happened yesterday, the challenges that you have encountered along the way. But I would also like to hear what a progress is made in building the conditions for these elections. Thank you very much, Rector.
Estás en silencio, Roberto.
Roberto, you have your mic on mute.
Si te puedes quitar el mute, ahora sí. Adelante.
Okay, please go ahead. Thank you very much for the invitation. I was actually going to read my complete statement that I issued yesterday. The detention of political leaders like Freddy Guevara and things we have seen that in place of creating the conditions that we need in the country appear to just lead to more abstentions in this election, and they favor just certain political powers. This does not contribute to recovering democracy in Venezuela. To the contrary, it just increases the environment of fear and division, social division that we see. The lack of legality and due process and the criminalization of any criminal reports leads to the fracturing of any process, the democratic process, and we need to ensure, and it actually leads us down the opposite path that we're looking for. As Diego said, there has been a great debate on political participation. Yesterday in the morning, I was talking to friends in Voluntad Popular who were communicating directly with Freddie on the possibility of them participating in the primary elections to determine who their candidates would be in certain states. Why is this? Why are these regional elections for November so important? They are important because after 2016, the electoral conditions have been deteriorated, and rebuilding these conditions will take time. Let's recall that we had 75% participation in 2015, and it went down to just a fraction of that for 2020. The government has refused to recognize elections. There has also been very low representation since 2017, and also in 2019, 2020, there has been very little respect for these elections. These elections and the negotiations that have occurred until now and that will continue in the future are opportunities to stop this deterioration and create a narrative for political change that will allow us to progressively recover institutional framework and the participation of all the parties. It will also create a pivotal point for social mobilization. Regardless of what the scenario is going forward, we must boost trust in the system and any other, and this is an obstacle that we have to overcome, and we must be able to preserve the few spaces that there are to be able to build this trust. We have seen significant advances in the electoral sphere, but we have so much more progress to make.
No ocurría desde 2020. Hemos tenido una jornada del registro electoral con una duración de 45 días que termina el próximo jueves y más de 700 puntos en todo el país. Han participado más de 1 millón de personas.
More than 1 million people have imposed, despite the political campaign or CNE for the lack of resources and the little mobilization. An audit of the entire CNE's automated platform has been launched, and they've acted for 4 weeks and in a detailed format beginning on July 16th. We've brought back the Mesa de Unidad, which is the party that received the most votes in the history of Venezuela, with political actors who have been participating and are coming back. We can have skilled international observers after a series of technical and political discussions. The European Union is trying to decide right now if the conditions are in place for such observation. And lastly, we've announced the elimination of the red point and the protectorate. What is lacking? We have to have public officials, public businesses involved, and we have to enable political leaders to participate without being prosecuted. The Constitution establishes that nobody can have their ability to take part in elections abridged unless they have been convicted of a crime. So we still require post-election conditions for those who have been elected to assume their positions without interference. This explains as well the discussion of all of these different laws. We also have to reestablish the symbols of the political parties. Roberto, I apologize for interrupting, and maybe we can go back to this question after we talk to Colette and David. And I wanted to refer to what you were talking about trust and some of the progress that's been achieved. When what we're seeing to be developed right now compared to what we've seen in the past 5 years, we can say that some progress has been made in reestablishing the CND. Of course, it's not balanced and not within a context of a country with democratic freedoms. There have, however, been steps forwards. I would like to hear from Colette and David to talk about the presence of these irregular groups, the attacks against human rights defenders, et cetera, et cetera. But Colette, I think that we all believe that the role of civil society right now, which is so critical for the history of Venezuela, is key. And this is a role that has become increasingly important and influential. We wanted to hear a little bit about the role of civil society at this critical juncture and looking at what specific opportunities there are and what the role of civil society should be to continue to exercise change in society. Thank you. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The first thing we have to have very clear is the Maduro regime is an authoritarian regime. Therefore, different strategies and relationships have to be developed. This is something that has been made very clear, especially in recent months. Venezuela has a very complex humanitarian emergency and political emergency. There are two different environments that exist when you have an authoritarian regime. The humanitarian side about development of civil society, which is really the only space in which there can be communication with society, between society and the authoritarian regime. This is what's traditionally happened. And as political spaces are closing, the humanitarian space becomes even more important. Its raison d'etre becomes more significant. On the humanitarian side, we've seen possibilities to build a path towards reinstitutionalization. In other words, to ensure that some key institutions can start to rebuild. The Venezuelan political process has been in decline for 20 years. So rebuilding it is not going to come from just a change in administration. There are changes that have to be made to rebuild institutions in all areas. There's a particular juncture here where we have civil society organizations that have been able to put forward a program for socio-political intermediation, or at least influence, wherein their relationships within the socio-political environment and the relationship with the government can facilitate processes for change. And of course, this has to go hand in hand with political change. We have to be very clear about that. No political change can only be pursued by civil society, nor can civil society be the only main actor. What it is to take advantage of this privileged position that their work gives them to be a hinge, a way of connecting and mobilizing initiatives that help to rebuild and recover institutions and to create the conditions that are favorable to political change and rebuilding of institutions. The CNE nowadays, the fact that they're working and moving in a direction that is not necessarily that of in the interest of the authoritarian government, it has to do with pressure from civil society and something more general within society where they have to work with opportunities that authoritarian regimes don't give. It doesn't mean that this is going to achieve political change. It's just a way to guide action. But civil society can facilitate processes that would not happen otherwise because the authoritarian regimes distrust and they play this political game as they know to do. I think, therefore, there has to be some sort of convergence of political actors. And of course, I'm always tempted to talk about much of what's already been said this morning, but I won't do that. But civil society has assets that it can bring to the table in negotiation and electoral participation to recover trust from the public and institutions and votes. What they want is people to go back to vote, not how they vote. That's something civil society can't determine, nor any experts can. The idea is to rebuild trust. The events of yesterday, I think we should not be surprised. This is what these types of regimes do. They build a path and then they say, whoa, 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 hold on. That's going too far. We can't give up that much. So now we're going to take some steps back. We're going to take back some of our control and territory, politically speaking, and then we'll see if we can continue to move forward. I'm going to interrupt you right now, Colette, because on that very point, it brings me to what I wanted to discuss with David. A key part of this is while this is happening, it's to be expected, it's predictable, and we've spent decades dealing with autocratic regimes, and this government is a dictatorship, and that's how it governs. But society, civil society, parties have been persecuted on the one hand, but there are places where they can exercise a pressure inside and outside the country. So, David, thank you very much for coming today. We're very pleased to have you. In your role within the Organization of American States, we know they've had a tricky relationship with Chavez and now Maduro. But thinking about processes of rebuilding institutions that give the international community another voice or another forum for grievances or reports. to ensure that political rights are respected in Venezuela. Is there any form in which the OAS is exercising pressure with allies, with its members, to be part of this, or to at least be a voice that supports civil society and democratic forces so that they can continue to move forward? Thank you very much for the invitation to you and to Atlantic Council, and my greetings to Kevin and Sarah, who came before us, and Roberto and Colette. Today, I have to begin by mentioning what happened, the arbitrary arrest of Freddy Guevara. He has been disappeared for more than 24 hours. He is somebody who I've worked with to serve the country. We did so together 15 years, and this started when we were students together in Caracas. He's a good friend, a friend who was arrested by SEDIN, a security force that has been accused of committing crimes against humanity. They extrajudicially execute innocent Venezuelans. So we're very pleased to hear the statements from the international community, but we don't want them to leave it at that. They have to continue to demand he be freed and that all other political prisoners be freed. And we especially call on the European Union team that's there right now in situ to call for this and to follow up. Now, speaking in my role as the OAS, as being the special envoy for Venezuelan refugees and migrants, the OAS has the most prestige and credibility when it comes to monitoring and observing electoral processes in the region, whether those be local, whether they be national or referendums. Most recently, we've seen cases as the observations in Peru and Bolivia and Suriname, and it's incredible that the OAS has not been invited to observe any type of elections in Venezuela. These are the legitimate interests of the Venezuelans are represented at the OAS through Ambassador Gustavo Tarre, who has been fulfilling that role for more than 2 years, when most of the countries, the member states, would not recognize the ambassador sent by the regime. Why is it important to have an organization that is so expert in regional election processes? Okay, let's look at what's happened in Venezuela from the exploratory mission of the European Union, a 3-day shootout in Caracas. Uh, the arbitrary arrest and disappearance for more than 24 hours or nearly 24 hours of Freddy Guevara, and the siege against interim President Juan Guaido. The millions of Venezuelans who have left, or the thousands of Venezuelans who have left Venezuela since that mission arrived, and those who are threatened because they've denounced the existence of these irregular armed groups. There are 175 voting centers in Caracas, and this is where we saw these shootings recently. So in the state of Apure, which forced the displacement of 6,000 Venezuelans, there are 75,000 electors. And if we go to Bolivar, which is controlled completely by the ELN and other armed groups, there are 1 million voters. Unfortunately, there are no conditions, and I can speak about from the perspective of a mayor who was forced out of office, and there's an arrest warrant out for him because he's part of the opposition. But you cannot just have elections for election's sake, say go out and vote just to vote. To tell people to go out and vote where the conditions are not in place for honest and fair elections and negotiations. And with this, I'll wrap up. They're not looking at, in these negotiations that will be mediated by Norway, the solution defies that the United Nations has asked for these extermination groups, as they're known, as these death squads, they have to be dismantled. This would have an impact on the election process, and to put an end to the ecocide and Amazonas and the Amazon region where there's illegal mining that has an impact on the health and the rights of the inhabitants of that part of Venezuela, and to go back and review sanctions. Those can be reviewed, but for anyone that has been removed, they have to expel the Cubans in Venezuela. So when all of these are on the table because of some of the deep-seated problems, nothing else is being resolved. Thank you, David. There's something else I think is important to highlight here, is that the conditions are worsening as the years pass in Venezuela. The conditions are lower for the governing elite. But I also don't think that the regime is going to offer or gift these conditions to the Venezuelan people. And therefore, I think it's very important, beyond the strategy and the decisions being made by the G4 and the opposition, that beyond the honesty or not is the consistency of the political rhetoric. What we want to promote in this space and continue to promote is that we have to rid ourselves of the dichotomy of participating or not, because I'm sure the regime is constantly thinking about their next move in a democratic or free country. These are absolute black and white discussions of what we can achieve. And I want to connect the what we can get. Go back to you, Rector. We heard the representative from Canada and the United States, and we just heard from David and Colette their arguments about this situation, which is legitimate and it's serious. Is it possible to get to November with some minimum conditions that the international community would consider sufficient? And if not, in terms of rebuilding institution, what do you believe is achievable? You're still on mute. I think it's very possible to reach an agreement that's broad to enable political leaders who have been disqualified to be requalified, to allow these campaigns that would eliminate the political advantage that the incumbents have. We've always seen that in Venezuela. There also has to be integrated negotiations, the matter of the party cards. That is not something under the purview of CNE. And then the TCJ, and their actions in the post-election period. All of these are actions that have to be within the negotiations. I believe that if we can have elections that meet international standards, and if the OAS can come in and observe, and if political parties that have not participated since 2017 come back, I think we could rebuild institutions, and this would help us to build trust. And after that, this would evolve to recreate these institutions and help to move forward in the negotiations, which should begin as soon as possible. This is about getting past this inertia, this feudal inertia. We could become a Somalia, which could be one of the hotspots, as we've seen in recent months. In terms of the feudal, the king is the one who reestablishes. Maduro is being clearer than we are when they're looking at their coalition
al gobierno, pues.
and the advantages of the government. And this is something that the entire country needs, that they need these institutions to be rebuilt to stop this spiral, and that is starting in common spaces where we can find common ground, we will rebuild trust to build the country amongst us all.
Que los puntos en la agenda de la negociación.
We hope that the points on this negotiation agenda will address all these issues that David mentioned, but we have to be realistic about what is actually possible. And I hope that we will be able to move forward realistically into the near future. Thank you very much, Rector. Thank you very much to the others. I know time is out, but I wanted to say that we still have much conversation before us, and we need to continue looking for common visions around this topic. We know that there isn't enough conversation in Venezuela about this issue, about the democratic alternative. We have to continue moving forward. Our greetings to everyone who's working there, working with the civil society to continue looking for spaces here in Venezuela. Thank you, David. I know that you are working for this a future reconstruction and to make sure that these voices and your perspective is incorporated, because you have been a victim for the systemic persecution of the regime, and you know how this works, and you know what could happen in the future, how we can recover democracy, and of course, your voice, Rector Picon, because against all odds and criticism and the attacks on your own reputation, you are taking a stand and an honest participation. We would like to congratulate you on the work that you're doing and the work that you are going to do throughout the negotiation to rebuild our country, in which the majority, the vulnerable majority, we hope will be able to go out and give voice to their will. We are not all part of the problem, but we all have a duty to be part of the solution. Thank you very much to those who have been participating in this conversation. We will continue to be promoting this type of conversation. Thank you again for those who have participated, and we'll see you at the next conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much. My greetings to everyone. Thank you. Have a great day.